Hey guys, welcome back to the Career Labs Season 2. I'm Aiden, joined by Ben and Sean. And today we have someone very special. He was my lit teacher in ACSI, John. Today, however, John has left the classroom and now works at Temasek. John, welcome and thank you for coming on. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me. As Aiden said, long ago, maybe not so long, it was just after NS. My first job was as a relief teacher, and I taught English literature, English language, theory of knowledge at ACS Independent, and then went back to teach a few more times, Sec 1, Sec 2, Sec 3, Sec 4. Currently, I work at the Center for Impact Investing and Practices, which is a nonprofit entity established by Temasek Trust, which is the philanthropic and social impact arm of Temasek. In my day job, a lot of what we do is try to support the growth of the impact investing sector in Asia. And the simplest definition of impact investment is an investment in a company that is trying to achieve positive social or environmental outcomes. And we can get into that a little bit more later. So a lot of research. I helped to run a startup fellowship program, helped to organize training sessions and classes, and all kinds of things in my line of work. That's the day job, and I actually am still teaching. Sometimes I still run workshops or give talks in schools on occasion, which is part of my other life where I am involved in Singapore's creative writing community. So that's a very quick overview of my work life.
Right. Thank you. So, actually, before you got into your job, you actually mentioned that you studied English at a Cambridge and then further went on to get a master's at Yale. So, could you touch a bit more on how your time at Cambridge was like the course structure and how's the learning style in Cambridge? Because it is pretty different to compared to what we have here in Singapore.
Sure. Yeah, even though it's different, Cambridge has still managed to inflict trauma on many generations of students by administering and grading O levels and A levels. So, I think the logo still sends shudders down the spines of many a Singaporean student. I was there studying English literature, and the basic structure of most undergraduate programs at Cambridge is what's known as the tripos, which is a three-part curriculum. That varies depending on the subjects that you do. I was an English literature student, arts and humanities, and across my 3 years, got to read all kinds of work. So, the earliest work that we were reading was maybe from the 1400s, extending all the way into the present period. Unlike other schools that might have a semestral system, Cambridge kind of had a trimester system, but each term was about 8 weeks long, with long breaks in between, so maybe 6 weeks. And the logic behind the structure was that in those 8 weeks, as an art student, I was writing essays every single week, maybe 1 to 4 essays a week, and I would go in for what's called a supervision, which is recognized as one of the kind of defining features of pedagogy and teaching at Cambridge. It was basically a one-to-one session with a professor, where I would have given them my essay, and then they would have grilled me for an hour, asking me why I made this argument, why how it could substantiate one line of reasoning, certain areas that I might have missed, or certain scholars that I might not have looked at properly when I was preparing the essay. And it was this kind of relentless academic pressure for 8 weeks. I have joked with friends. When I was there, I compared it to being like in a boxing ring. You slug it out for 8 weeks and then you crawl out to rest. But the principle of the 6 weeks actually was so that you could spend those 6 weeks reading for the next term, so that you wouldn't get caught out reading and writing all in the same week, though in reality, that's probably how it happened for a lot of arts and humanities students. So that was kind of the structure of it over 3 years. Every term was doing maybe 2 subjects. So, one from a certain period of time, focusing on the literature of that period of time, and then what's called practical criticism, which is focused on close textual analysis of, texts, it could be from a poem or a play or a novel, complemented by a little bit more understanding of literary theory. The first 2 years were constituted what we call part 1 of the tripos, and then my third year was part 2. Over my first 2 years, I took I think, 6 classes or 6 papers, and that culminated in kind of mixed methods. In terms of examination, I had to write a dissertation, I had to submit a portfolio of essays, and then for the remaining 4 subjects, I actually had to do handwritten exams. So think of it like A levels. I had to write 3 essays in 3 to 3.5 hours. And then because I graduated in COVID, in my 3rd year, instead of doing handwritten exams, all of them became online submittable assignments. So I completed my final term rather, remotely when I was here in Singapore. So this was back in 2020, and I did lack a little bit of confidence in the British government's strategy for addressing COVID at the time. And so I came back to Singapore and I finished my degree remotely here. So that's a very kind of brief glimpse into what my undergraduate education was like.
Wow, that's very interesting. I was wondering, and I think a lot of Singaporean students are wondering how you even got into Cambridge in the first place. Because I understand that you applied to Cambridge via UCAS. Is there
Yep.
any difference in applying for Cambridge versus the rest of the unis, especially compared to other G5 unis? And
Yep.
what separates a Cambridge-worthy student and a not so Cambridge-worthy student?
Like for that level of detail, you should ask the admissions officers. But what I can say is that what was different about the application process first, and I applied to Cambridge at this point. It was maybe 11 years ago when I was in NS. So I'm sure there are certain things that have changed or a bit outdated. So what was part of my process was, on top of the usual personal statement and grades that I had to submit, I had to write an additional supplementary essay about my experiences studying English Lit as an IB student. And then after that, usually what happens for any applicant to both Cambridge and Oxford is that they will send someone down to do an interview. And the purpose of the interview is to kind of simulate the learning environment at Cambridge. So this one-to-one setup where a professor is basically grilling you about a subject that you're coming to terms with for the first time for like an hour. And I do think people tend to look at it as like, oh, this daunting final challenge that will determine whether you're worthy to go or not. But when I look back, I have come to understand that it's really a way of testing whether or not a prospective student would actually even do well in that kind of teaching environment. Some people might prefer a seminar, some people might prefer, groups of 4 to 10. Some people prefer a lecture where you're in a lecture hall with 200 other students. And I have seen people over the course of my time in uni who really did not do well with the pressure of being, one-to-one with a professor. And especially if there's like maybe a personality mismatch, or, there was some kind of something else that was not right with the way that they were relating to one another. So, personal essay, grades, supplementary essay, as well as the interview. I do know, I understand that nowadays when kids apply for Cambridge, they might actually have to do a kind of entrance exam or English, some kind of assignment on the spot, but I'm not sure about the exact details. And for me, the interview, kind of long story short, I ended up being able to do it online, and this was before everyone got used to video calls and Zoom. So I did my interview over Skype, and I had 2 professors who interviewed me. One was an expert in contemporary American literature, so meaning 20th century, and the other was a specialist in 18th century literature. And so they were taking turns asking me questions. Sean and Aidan, you were in ACSI, so you're familiar with the IB system. So what they were doing was that they were asking me very detailed questions about my extended essay, which happened to be about American writers writing in the 1950s and 60s. So it was just my luck that the professor who was interviewing me was an expert in the area that I did my extended essay on as an IB student, which really meant that he picked it apart, grilled me, asked me some difficult questions. And then the other professor asked me questions kind of about texts that were older, because she was an 18th century person. And so then I had to dig into the kinds of things that I did, that were older. So, Shakespeare as usual. I remember in IB I studied a play by the playwright John Webster, and I think trying to remember what I learned about him when I was in school, those kinds of things. So that's what I would say is a bit different about the process. And yeah, not everyone does well in it or through it, and I think that's okay. Yeah.
Thank you, John. That was really insightful. So you studied art for your undergrad in the University of Cambridge, and then you proceeded on to do a master's in East Asian Studies in Yale.
Yep.
So, what made you pivot from studying English to East Asian Studies, and how was this transition?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's the more personal kind of answer, and then there's the also kind of broader. I don't know how strategic it was, but there was an element of it being strategic that made sense to me at the time. So the more personal answer is that over the course of my time as an undergrad, I felt a little bit alienated from the curriculum at times. One of the things that we had to do when I was in my first year that still has stayed with me is that we had to translate texts from the 1300s from Middle English or medieval English into contemporary English. And I had a real crisis, or kind of crisis of kind of maybe not an existential crisis, but a little bit of a personal crisis. Because back then, I can speak a bit more Korean now, but I could barely speak any Korean back then, and I'm Korean on my mom's side. I remember thinking, what am I doing here, translating this Middle English into contemporary English when I cannot, I can barely hold a conversation with my grandmother. And a lot of the structure of the English literature course at Cambridge was such that at that time it was very possible for a student to go through all 3 years without studying a writer who is, and this is the joke that we used to say, is who's not male, pale, and stale. So kind of ignoring the fact that there are many writers from different ethnic backgrounds who are writing in English, as well as others from other parts of the world whose work was translated into English. There was very little kind of awareness of that when I was studying back then. And so that kind of seeded this idea that maybe I want to get better acquainted with what we call the Sinitic literary tradition, which I would classify as maybe slightly different from Chinese per se, because we talk about the influence of classical Chinese from the 600, 700, 800 AD period, the ways that has influenced a variety of countries and nations. So we could say that Japan, Korea, Vietnam have this kind of influence as part of the heritage, which is different from saying that they have a Chinese influence. So that's one distinction I would draw, and that was something that I wanted to learn more about. And so even when I applied to Yale, my intentions were really to try to understand this literary tradition and heritage a little bit better. And the strategic bit, actually, that I was thinking about was the fact that I think it was kind of a common sentiment at the time among friends and other people that I'd met and worked with, that understanding China was going to continue to be very important. Given its continuing growth in terms of its economy, in terms of its broader global geopolitical presence, in terms of its technological capabilities. And I think a lot of folks, maybe predominantly in US, Europe, were often seeing things through very transactional terms and not really seeing things through the longer arc of China's history. Even though there is very, very complex history, and the jump from the dynastic periods in however many centuries ago through the ruptures of 19th to 20th centuries, the wars, the revolutions, the installation of the CCP in power, all of these things. It's a very tumultuous and complicated history. But I felt like I learned a little bit about that period through studying history for IB when I was in ACSI. And then I felt like I wanted to go deeper into this kind of intellectual lineage, and then maybe see how I could connect things all the way through. I don't know how sophisticated I could say my understanding of Chinese history or the way things run in China is right now, but I like to think that at least I learned a little bit more to be able to understand what's going on in the world today, the way that different countries relate to China, the way that Chinese officials or representatives feel misunderstood, and then in turn understanding how Singaporeans may be able to delicately manage that relationship, let's say. So those are some of the motivations back then.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree that Singapore standing like on a fine line between China as well as the sort of Western countries. And I think what you mentioned was actually like pretty interesting overall. And however, so you went from Cambridge to Yale. Maybe you could touch a bit more on about the differences or like the similarities between these sort of two universities, right? Because they are both pretty highly regarded in the global education scene. So I'm sure a lot of our viewers are curious about what's the similarities between them or differences.
Sure. So this is a little kind of historical thing. So as many people would be aware, the United States started in part as a set of colonies governed by the British, predominantly along the east coast of the United States. And many of the first institutions of higher education or learning, such as Harvard or Yale, continue to look back to universities in the UK as their kind of benchmark or model. So, Oxbridge representing that very clearly or distinctly, to the extent that if you are to visit Harvard or Yale or other schools, kind of, known as the Ivy League schools like Princeton or University of Pennsylvania, these schools share many superficial similarities in terms of the architecture. You walk around and you kind of feel like, oh, there are a lot of aesthetic similarities across these campuses. And part of that is reflective of this overall, if not nostalgia, maybe envy, or this continuous looking back to British education. And this is, I think Yale was maybe established in the 1700s, whereas schools like Oxford and Cambridge were established, I want to say Oxford was established like 1200s and Cambridge in the 1300s. So that kind of almost like Oxbridge envy or post-imperial gaze, maybe. To the extent that when I went to Yale, there was a degree of uncanny similarity. I walk around and be like, some of this feels very familiar. And then I go on campus tours and learn about the architecture and the intention behind the design of some of the buildings. And they would openly say, oh yeah, Yale had Oxbridge envy. So what they would do not only was to mimic the architectural styles of the Oxbridge colleges, but they would also introduce imperfections to make the buildings look older. So for example, they would acid wash the exterior of some of the buildings. Or one of the famous buildings in Yale is the library. And the architect who designed the library, actually, his dream was to design and build a chapel. But Yale didn't need a chapel. So instead he said, can I just do it anyway and then you use it as your library? So the Yale Library, that's the setup of it now. And as part of this desire to introduce imperfection, they deliberately went and chipped or put cracks in the stained glass in the library. So this idea of trying to harken back to a much older form of education. And so this is connected to the long history of European settler colonialism in the United States, the kind that obscured and killed a lot of Native Americans. So that's just a very superficial starting point. When I was walking around Yale, I would think, oh, this is weirdly familiar. Now, in terms of education, my time at Yale was characterized more by the seminar style classes that I mentioned. The semesters were longer, maybe 14 weeks. My classes, they would vary by size, but I ended up not taking many lecture classes. I would say the size varied maybe between 10 to 70 students. But because I was a graduate student, I would sometimes have to take additional classes with professors. And in those instances, sometimes it was just me and the professor, or it was me and the other graduate students in my class and the professors. So, I took classes where there were a mix of undergrads and grad students. And so, of course, they had to hold the grad students to higher academic expectations. So there are a lot of weeks where, they would assign the reading and then we would show up for discussion. But because I'd become so used to writing essays every week, whenever I was just assigned reading, I would be like, oh, there's like, it almost feels like there's not much work to do. I just have to read and come prepared for discussion. And then, the style of discussion was also very different. I think if I were to be a little bit uncharitable, and I'm sure maybe, you guys have sensed this in some of your classes or some of your seminar style setups in school. They're the people who have an actual point that they're trying to make or contribution to the discussion. And then there are the people who feel like they have to say something for the sake of saying something. I think maybe in Singapore, sometimes the perverse incentive is the class participation. But when I was there in class, sometimes, people would say something because they just felt like they needed to say it, or you would have someone who was thinking out loud in a way that would take up quite a bit of, the oxygen in a discussion. So, that was, I was sometimes lukewarm about that, let's say. But other times, the seminar is great because, especially for a topic that everyone is kind of approaching together for the first time, everyone is able to contribute a little bit of what they know. So, for example, I took a class on the politics of culture. So it was an anthropology class focused on Southeast Asia. And because Southeast Asia is so diverse, every week we were reading a different book that was studying a different country. And our professor, he's an expert in kind of urban studies and urbanization in Vietnam. And he kind of laid it out at the beginning of the class that he was by no means an expert on every country in Southeast Asia. And because our class was quite diverse, he expected that everyone would be able to bring a different perspective. Me and another friend, we're from Singapore, so we can speak about Singapore a bit more authoritatively. Someone else knows a little bit more about Indonesia. Someone else knows more about Thailand. Someone else knows a little bit about the Philippines. So that kind of environment actually made for quite a conducive, quite a conducive set of conditions for good conversations to happen. So that's the strength that can come with that kind of model of teaching as well. Actually, sorry, I remember I had one class where it was just the four of us, but this was more like a PhD level class, and it was the four of us and one professor. So that was another different level of kind of academic engagement and scrutiny. 14 weeks, so that meant that around halfway through we would have midterm exams that did contribute to the final grade, and then a final exam or a final assignment or submission. And I remember remembering that one thing that was different about that was that the classes and the class load didn't change, still getting the reading, still meeting up every week, but just that we also had an additional assignment to submit. And when you're doing 4 or 5 classes and your deadlines are all within the same 1-2 weeks, it can get quite difficult, which may be similar to what you're experiencing in school now. Whereas when I was in Cambridge, it was kind of exams that were only at the very end. So maybe I forgot to mention this. So for my first 2 years, all of my exams were at the end of those 2 years. We had prelims in my first year, but those didn't count toward our final grade. And then third year, all the exams again were in the last term. Whereas, being in an American university, that kind of campus setup, it was more kind of regular assessment, maybe through the term or through the semester. Or maybe to give another example where it was regular testing that contributed to my final grade, I took classical Chinese for 1 year, and so this meant studying Chinese as it was, written in the classical period, which is that kind of 600 to early 11th century kind of period. And that was like the hardest class that I took. Actually, it brought back all these like traumatic memories of Tingxie, because I was literally like every week I had to memorize grammar, I had to memorize characters that meant very different things back then compared to what they mean now. And I don't know if you guys remember 默写, where you have to memorize a passage and then you have to like write it out. And I was doing that in this like old Chinese. So that, those weekly tests contributed to my overall grade on top of like exams and then a final translation assignment. So that's my slightly long-winded answer about some of the similarities and differences.
Wow, that's very, very interesting. Yeah, certainly you speaking Chinese and saying the words "things" here definitely sends shivers down my spine. There's words I never want to hear again. But now let's before we move on to talk about your job, which is impact investing. I wanted to touch a bit on your brief stint as a relief teacher in ACSI, because in our offline chat you did mention that you still have a passion to be a teacher, and clearly, with how eloquently you're speaking, you make a very good teacher. So I'm just wondering why exactly you've moved away from this role to something quite different.
Yeah. I mean, I did consider it seriously, but I don't think I felt the strong compulsion to pursue it full time, which is not to say that it's not a good career path. I just had the feeling that It wasn't quite for me at the time. And the fact that there's a part of me that still enjoys teaching, which is why I'm happy to do workshops and I'm happy to do talks and to engage with students. And the alternate kind of pathway of my life would have seen me going on to do a PhD, which I did apply for. I applied to do, English literature PhDs, and if I was on that kind of career trajectory, then eventually I would have been teaching undergraduates in university, but I didn't get in, and I didn't reapply, so that pathway hasn't quite transpired. But I do think, there are a lot of people who are former teachers who have gone on to be very effective in other roles because, communication is important. The ability to engage a room of sometimes uncooperative listeners is important. The ability to explain concepts to different audiences while having a sensitivity to how well they know the subject matter, that's also important. And I think these are some of the skills that you carry on, but that's just the classroom stuff. And what you guys maybe didn't see was like all the admin, doing risk assessments every time, you have to go out of school to do some activity, the prep work that went into preparing, presentations and class notes, and even just like marking, setting exams, PTM, all these kinds of things, which, have stayed with me. And it's been a long time since I was your teacher. I think it's 9 years now, because I taught in 2017. So that's the short answer. And I do still think that I am making some kind of positive contribution to education broadly, both in my day job and the other things that I do on the side, just by having material publicly available from the research that I do for my day job, and otherwise trying to share a little bit about what I know and understand of creative writing and English literature every time I'm invited to engage students in whatever way that I'm asked to.
Wow. I mean, it's great to see that you're still very fond of education, but I guess life had different plans. Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe you could explain to us what exactly you're doing now, because honestly, when I heard about impact investing, I was like, huh? What even is that? So I had to Google it up
Yeah.
myself. So maybe you could touch on about what exactly is impact investing.
Sure. Maybe one way to go at it would be to try and resuscitate some old econ concepts. So your positive and negative externalities of economic activity. The unintended or secondary positive or negative effects that can come from some kind of business activity or an investment. I think the notion of impact can be understood maybe quite simply in those terms, which is that any kind of investment, in a company, any kind of company, will have positive and negative impacts or effects. And so the question is, as an investor, do you feel the kind of obligation to try to manage that? Do you feel desire to have the companies that you invest in, provide a good or a service that leads to positive outcomes, whether it's for community or, on the environment, or do you want to turn a blind eye? So that would be another way that I might, define impact investing, investing in companies to try to generate those positive externalities while managing the negative externalities. And not just because negative externalities are bad for PR, right? But more because, we want to move toward a kind of financial economic system that delivers better outcomes for customers and communities. And the other thing that I would say is that sometimes in certain countries, the public sector or the governments are hobbled in their ability to deliver essential services. And I don't personally believe that, privatization or private sector solutions are the main way that some of these things should be delivered, like healthcare, access to a bank account, education. But there are some instances where if there are founders or companies that have these good intentions and they are determined to make sure that their companies stay true to these missions, then they can effectively not just deliver these services and goods well, but because they're operating as businesses with good business plans, good commercial strategies, they can also expand. So that's a kind of brief overview, or one way that I might describe impact investing. And so some of the sectors that I look at for my job are some of what I mentioned. So people might think of renewables. Do look at renewables. People might think about inclusive financial services. So in Southeast Asia, I think there are something like 300 million people who don't have bank accounts, or they have bank accounts and they don't use it because they're not so familiar with the mechanics of a bank account, or why do I even need to have a bank account or save? So how can you have financial service providers, whether they're microfinance institutions or kind of rural or community banks, or even fintechs that are innovating to deliver services to rural or underserved areas to improve access to financing for some of these customers? So inclusive finance, renewables, healthcare, think about that. Education, we think about that as well, especially ed tech. Think about agriculture. More recently for my job, we're thinking about climate adaptation and resilience, which maybe to put it in brief is how to find solutions that can help people adapt to the consequences of climate change. This is a more pessimistic view, which assumes that we're not going to be able to hit our temperature reduction targets or greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. So if that's going to be difficult, then people just have to buckle up and prepare for more floods and cyclones and typhoons and heat waves, coastal erosion, all these kinds of things. So for my job now, part of what I'm doing is trying to understand what are the kinds of solutions that exist in the world, how are businesses preparing or adapting or anticipating these risks, how can more investment flow to solutions that are helping to better ensure that communities are protected when it comes to some of these challenges. So hopefully that's a good or clear enough description of this concept of impact investment.
Right. Speaking more about your job, right? So you mentioned that you do like sort of research into what companies are doing to respond to sort of climate change and all these environmental impacts. So maybe you could run us through your day-to-day sort of routine or activity at your job.
Sure. I think my job is a little bit unorthodox in that there's not necessarily a fixed day-to-day. I think if I were to look back, and I've been at this job about 3.5 years, will be 4 by the end of this year. Every year, maybe what has anchored me specifically has been the deliverable, the delivery of a deliverable. So, a big report about an area that we think deserves more attention, and we try to contribute to data collection and analysis, as well as some more qualitative analysis through interviews and other kinds of engagements to consolidate in reports on investment areas that we think investors should consider more closely. So in my first year, it was like a landscape report. What's the market for impact investing like? In the year that followed, I moved on to a project on financial inclusion, which was, as I mentioned, about improving access to bank accounts, access to e-wallets, access to loans and credit, and improved financial literacy and education across Southeast Asia. Another big project that followed after that was about supply chain transformation. How do we help micro, small, and medium enterprises across the region adopt some of these sustainable practices, for fear that some of these international companies that have stricter procurement standards that become more aligned with sustainable standards globally, look at these companies that don't comply and say, we're going to cut you out, meaning that these micro, small, medium companies all of a sudden lose kind of a lifeline or lose one of their big customers. After that, there was a report on applications of digital technology for sustainable development, worked on a report on sustainable agriculture, and now this report on climate adaptation and resilience. So if I were to think about the process of doing interviews and designing surveys and working with consulting firms and survey firms to administer these surveys and consolidate all of these insights, then the day-to-day could be a mix. It could be interviewing a company or an investor to better understand their commercial and sustainability strategy or impact strategy. I could be working with some of these other partners who are helping to run surveys. I could be talking to research partners who have come alongside us for a particular project to, kind of update one another on where we are in our respective lines of work. I could be just reading, because there are a lot of reports that have been published by, universities or international organizations, like different UN agencies or World Bank agencies that are looking at some of these issues and trying to see what's relevant for the reports that we're writing. So that's kind of on the research side. I do help to organize a lot of events for my job, usually around these similar topics. So not just impact investing, but sometimes, I might contribute to an event that looks at inclusive finance and financial health, or I might help to work on or co-organize a workshop on innovative financing structures. Or I could be organizing a roundtable on impact investment topics. So the kind of event management, and not just in the sense of doing logistics, but also trying to be intentional about what are the topics of discussion for people in the room. Sometimes I help with that. In the past year, I've started working on the Amplifier, which is the startup fellowship program that we run in partnership with another organization called the Philanthropy Asia Alliance. 12-month mentorship program for relatively earlier stage startups based on different themes every year. So this year, our cohort has 3 tracks. Companies that are coming up with innovative solutions to decarbonize fashion and textile sector. We have one track that is focused on improving access to employment for disadvantaged communities. So these are more kind of like a mix of social enterprises, and one of them is a bit more of a tech-based company. And then the other track is on sustainable solutions for the hospitality and tourism sector. So for that, it was less about research and more about how, like, setting up an application process, putting out the open call, organizing events and Q&A sessions for interested or prospective companies, being part of the evaluation process. And all of these companies on our program, they get paired with maybe 3 to 4 mentors. So there's also the process of engaging mentors and convincing them to come on board, and then matching them later on once the companies are selected. We also do deliver or provide a grant to all of these companies, so between 100 to 250,000 SGD, but dispersed in tranches for pilots or different projects that these companies are running. So that's some of what I do. Sometimes I go to conferences, sometimes I travel to meet partners in other countries. Sometimes I'll be doing more in-house kinds of things for Temasek Trust itself, working with other colleagues for things within the organization. So that's a kind of broad introduction to my day-to-day. So lots of different things, but very broadly, those are the kinds of different things that are capturing my attention every day.
Wow, it sounds. I don't want to say this. I can't. It sounds very, very interesting. But I was wondering, to me, intuitively, jumping into impact investing is such a broad job scope with, primarily an arts degree with English Lit and East Asian Studies. To me, it sounds like a huge jump. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So my question then is, practically, how did you make this jump? Was there a lot of on-job training involved? Did you have to take courses, or was there a lot of mentorship?
Yep. So if anything, I would say that I had a little bit of assurance from seeing other people who'd done English, who had made the move into very different fields. I think maybe one example that I could give is that the CEO of Standard Chartered Bank in Singapore, and I think he covers a few other markets in Southeast Asia as well, Malaysia, maybe Indonesia. He is an English grad. He does, his degree is in English. So, there are people like him who are out there who exist. And, the reality is that not every person who does an English degree is going to, adhere to the stereotypical kinds of jobs that people expect them to take, like, becoming a teacher or a journalist, or, studying again and becoming a lawyer. I think English majors, or, or at least as far as I can understand, are equipped to understand the kinds of organizations or companies that they're working with, understanding the context that they're operating in, understanding why it is things are the way that they are. And then, of course, it helps that you don't have to worry that an English major will write bad emails, which is still a very big part of a lot of jobs. For me, it's not like I was always interested in this kind of field. Tried a bunch of different things over the course of my undergrad years. I interned like at a fashion e-commerce startup. I interned at Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working in the ASEAN kind of department, or it's called a directorate. So I was at the ASEAN directorate. I interned at a nonprofit helping former sex workers to transition out of the sex trade. So that was based out of Geylang. I also interned at HealthSurf, which is providing legal, financial, and medical aid to migrant workers. So, I was kind of just drawn to different things, that were interesting to me, basically. I did intern with a newspaper in London as well. And then, one day it was a family friend who introduced this notion of impact investing and, helped me get an interview with an impact investing firm. And I was still kind of not entirely convinced that it was possible to bridge these two, delivering social and environmental impact while also generating a financial return. And I think I'm coming into maybe a bit more nuanced understanding that there are instances where you can have like a market commercial return because the economics of the company makes sense. And there are instances where you can't expect that kind of financial return from a company. So you have to be more focused on the actual positive social environmental impact that is being delivered. So kind of impact first approach to how you provide that capital to an organization or company. Other people call it catalytic capital because you provide the capital to an organization, and that can help to catalyze some kind of meaningful activity that they carry out. But anyway, so I was still on the fence, but I thought, I interned in the government, I interned in nonprofits. Let me try interning in this kind of private sector finance kind of job and see how things go. And when I first started out this internship at this private equity firm, that was a real kind of difficult period of realizing how much there was to learn. So I was on Investopedia basically every day, trying to understand acronyms, trying to understand financial terminology, trying to understand the discipline needed in performing financial due diligence, these kinds of things. Understanding why a kind of multiple or financial projection might be appealing to an investor. And still while bridging that with the fact that the companies that we were looking at were like renewables companies or microfinance companies or healthcare companies. So that was kind of my training ground the first time I interned there. And then the second time I interned there was during COVID. And I was involved as an intern with helping to write their first impact report, which was their first time really consolidating the data about what kind of positive impact that they were delivering. So understanding what was the impact case to be made. So for example, renewables is very straightforward. As a result of more people adopting my solar panels, how much less electricity generated from fossil fuels were they using? So then from there you can calculate a kind of rough greenhouse gas emission reduction. Or how many more customers have I been able to reach to deliver financial services because we helped this microfinance institution expand the range of its operations, things like that. So it was that second internship where I became a bit more familiar with the logic of an impact investment, because you don't just invest in a company because it sounds good. They need to lay out very clearly what is their, we call it a theory of change. How exactly is what we do going to contribute to a change in behaviors or change in systems, in a meaningful way that we can track. So it was those two internships. And then after that, I had the opportunity to intern at Temasek Trust. And I had gone in hoping to learn a little bit more about philanthropy, which I did end up doing. But a lot of that work was also spent understanding a bit more about what could be done, not just to set up impact investment funds, but to see what kinds of resources would be important to help the impact investing sector grow. So I was doing a lot of research about, like universities that had impact investment research hubs or research centers and things like that. So that was kind of internship experience that I had. And then when I went on to Yale to do my East Asian Studies degree, I kind of felt like, okay, I'm back in familiar territory, which is my arts and humanities territory. But my brain has also kind of had been trained in a certain way, and I was still reading up, a lot about climate change related topics. I mean, even as an undergrad in the UK, I would go for marches and protests for the university to divest from fossil fuels and things like that. So it was something that I cared about. And when I got to Yale, so one of the nice things about Yale is that they have one of the oldest schools of the environment in the US, which originated as a forestry management school. So because of that, they have a long history of doing research on these topics, and they have a lot of experts in-house who know about these topics as well. So that meant that when I was there, on top of doing my East Asian Studies stuff, I could go and audit classes at the School of the Environment. And I also applied for this fellowship with the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, which is a very interesting experience because the cohort was about half MBA students and half seminary students, or students training to be pastors and chaplains and ministers, which meant that every month we would come together and talk about future of agriculture or the future of urbanization, and they would all bring very different perspectives. The MBAs would come in, what's the business case, how do we model this, and then the seminarians would say, okay, that's all well and good, but pause, how do we talk to the communities who are the most affected or who feel like they've been left behind as some of these processes of transformation have occurred? How do we provide solace, how do we comfort them, how do we walk with them, things like these kinds of questions. And it was also interesting to me because the person who brought us all together was a very senior person from the company Patagonia, and so which is kind of quite well known, not just for being an apparel and fashion brand, but also kind of sticking very closely to their convictions about environmental conservation and sustainability. So it was a huge privilege to be able to learn from him as well. So I would say that it's kind of a mix of all these things, the internship experience, and then seeing how I could build from that internship experience that has eventually contributed to my current work day to day.
Well, it really goes to show that whatever we are studying in university does not determine our future career trajectory. Well, actually, I wanted to go more in depth about impact investing because I feel like us regular folk are probably more familiar with traditional investing, and some metrics that we will look at are, like, for example, a company's cash flow, their balance sheet, or their EBITDA. But
Yep.
for impact investing, what are some of the quantifiable metrics that you look at before you
Yep.
make your decision?
Yep. So for an impact investment firm, the ones that are well resourced will have two teams that perform the due diligence when they evaluate a deal. One is the finance team that will do, same thing. They'll look at cash flow, look at EBITDA, look at the balance sheets, CAGR, potential, metrics that they could track. And in parallel, the impact team is looking at, the potential of a company to deliver positive impact. And the tricky thing about impact data is that it's hard to find a framework that can harmonize hard to find a framework that's flexible enough to harmonize different data collected from companies in different sectors. So for example, there are some impact investors that only do healthcare, or there's some impact investors that only do financial services, or there's some impact investors that only do climate. Then there are those impact investors that say, we care about all of them, so we want to evaluate all of them. So there are frameworks that exist. So for example, there's an organization called Impact Frontiers, and they have kind of 5 metrics of how to assess impact. It's like, who are the customers? What is the service? How is it delivering the service? What is the depth? So, not just in delivering a service, but can you quantify whether or not meaningful changes happen in the person's life? And then risk, which is a different kind of risk management from financial risk management, but more the risk of the service provider not actually achieving this positive outcome. There are instances where there are certain flavors of the latter thinking that shape the financial thinking. So for a while, the financial sector really did embrace it's kind of net zero mandate, ESG mandate, began to understand how there were certain ESG risks that would have a material effect on their balance sheets. So, discounted cash flow that you would be able to assess based on certain ESG risk factors. Because at the end of the day, ESG is not fluff per se, even though it's gotten quite unpopular right now because of the current political mood, tenor. Actually, I mean, bombing countries and waging war is the opposite of ESG and impact law. Because a prerequisite for positive outcomes for people's lives and the environment is peace, right? We can go into beyond the number of people that have been killed, but also bombs, planes, military vehicles. The carbon emissions are ridiculous, but you can do whatever you want when you pull out of the Paris Agreement and you believe that climate change is a hoax and that you can just pretend that these things are not happening. Anyway, so there are some strands of, and I do think part of this does continue in many firms, thinking when they think about how is a drought going to damage or a flood going to damage an asset that I own that's in my portfolio. It might be hard to quantify, but I need to price it in somehow, because this is a risk. Because if my storefront is damaged, if my factory is damaged, that will affect its production capacity, and then that will have overall potential ramifications for monthly output. And if I don't have stock, then I don't have stock to sell. So that's one part. Or if you look at another part of the value chain, it is getting harder and harder for more of my goods to be transported because it's getting hotter, and my existing cooling facilities cannot keep my product fresh for the duration that it needs to travel from point A to point B. So I'm having a higher percentage of spoilage in my F&B or my other kinds of temperature sensitive goods. So how do you price that in? This is a little bit different from impact, but it's adjacent, because we're talking about these other factors that are not strictly speaking financial factors that do end up having an effect on the financial value of potential projections for sales. So it's something as simple as that. So we think about potential disruption risk to supply chain, to production, and so on. So there's a way that there is that kind of intersection. But if I were to go back, and this is maybe more from the perspective of like an asset owner or a large company that owns a lot of assets, from the kind of impact investor view, they do the traditional financial evaluation alongside impact evaluation. And then maybe if I were just a last thought, so we sometimes think of it as a spectrum. You can have traditional investing where the mandate is, I'm just going to put my money in whatever, and I don't care if it's bad for people's lives. You go one step beyond that. You think about responsible investing. So you could say, I'm building out my portfolio, but I want to exclude stocks in alcohol companies, tobacco companies, and pornography companies, and arms companies. Because that's my bottom line. That I don't really care about. So I'm going to exclude that. But everything else is fine. And then maybe you move toward ESG investing, which is more about, okay, let's look at companies that have this, that are actively monitoring their water efficiency, their electricity efficiency. They have good HR policies in place to manage their employees. They have a board of governors, or they have some kind of accountability mechanism for if things go wrong. So those kinds of stricter requirements for ESG. But even then, ESG can also mean a kind of compliance. We are just doing it because these are the rules that have been put in place. And then after that, maybe you move to impact investing, which is not so much about just complying to certain rules, but also about the actual positive outcome that you can deliver to the lives of communities or to the environment. So that's another way that people can think about it as well, from traditional all the way to impact. And then if you move beyond impact, then you're getting into the territory where it's me giving money, but I don't expect a financial return. So this is how philanthropic organizations and foundations usually work, right? I have a lot of money. There are some things that, I don't think I need to make money on. So for example, I'm going to give you a scholarship to go to university. It doesn't make sense to say, and then I'm going to charge you interest, or I expect a return on my investment. The mandate or the objective is different, right? I fund a scholarship, I fund educational programs, I fund sanitation and hygiene education programs in schools, that kind of thing. So that's just different ways that different organizations can use their money for different purposes, and also with different returns, if not appetites, then objectives. Yeah.
Thanks for that answer. That was really insightful. But now moving on to like the sort of last section of our episode here. Previously, you mentioned that there was this stereotype of art majors becoming sort of teachers or journalists, right? And I think it's really prevalent here in Singapore, especially. So, like me, I was actually interested in sort of sociology, but I was deterred by this sort of stereotype as well. So, what I want to know is that do you have any advice for students who are perhaps interested in these sort of arts, but also maybe not want to become like a teacher or a journalist, or who want to like basically explore other career options?
Yeah. I'm a big proponent of just like studying what you like, because there's no point slogging through a degree or an area that you're not interested in and feeling resentful at the end of the entire thing, whether toward yourself or toward peer pressure or familial pressure. Um, and a person who doesn't like the subject, a person who doesn't like law is not going to be a very good lawyer. A person who resented studying medicine is not going to be the best doctor, or at least that fundamental alignment with the subject studied will eventually affect just your relationship with your work and what you do. And I think that I think okay, we pause and talk about why Singapore has proceeded along these lines for a long time. You think about post-independence, the government's strategy was kind of industrial policy. We need to bring multinational corporations into Singapore that can not only set up facilities here, but also train our population, which is understandable, right? Because post-war, there were a lot of Singaporeans who were living in poverty. And so to meet the needs of these large corporations, a lot of it in manufacturing, there was a prevalence of focus on STEM and engineering. So to be familiar with the processes that were required in these factories, especially amidst mechanization, and also to work in the oil and gas industry, which maybe people forget, but it was one of those big foundational economic pillars in the 1960s and 70s. To the extent that if you talk to Singaporeans and generations, slightly older generations, they'll remember, oh, when I was in secondary school, if you couldn't make it, then you get put in arts. The smart kids all get put in the science stream, and then they move on and become engineers and doctors and what have you. And I do believe that it is linked to this economic strategy why certain subjects were emphasized or prioritized, at least in the Singapore context, right? And then if you continue on and you see, EDB's overtures to make Singapore into a center for biotech and pharma, or you look at the efforts to transform Singapore into a global financial center, or now this new push to make Singapore into a center of AI as well as green finance. All of these kinds of things that accompany those what we would consider in Singapore traditional industries like oil and gas or manufacturing or shipping. Then you can kind of see why there was this continued view that training in a certain set of subjects would mean that you would be a good worker, or that you would have a good career, you would be employable. And part of this is also just linked to the general paranoia of the Singapore government, right? Which is this view that if we are not ahead of the curve, if we are not focused on seeing how to compete with other people, then it's going to be very difficult for Singapore to survive, which is, been the kind of existential view that has been taken ever since Singapore left Malaysia. So which is all to say that these are some of the things that have shaped the attitudes of the people who are older than us in Singapore. There's an extent to which you could say it's understandable, because many of them came from a time of precarity. They came from a period where they remembered when Singapore was not a wealthy country. They remember a period of, I don't know, even having been lived under Japanese subjugation, or remembering a period when, let's say, for example, the Singapore River was always polluted because that was where all the farmers were going to let their animals, their livestock, just defecate, right? So for them, they link education in this particular way with increases in material living standards, which is linked to government strategy and policy. So, which is not to say that I agree with it, uh, more to say that I understand it, and it kind of characterizes why people think the way that they do. So, with that kind of context in mind, um, I think, or I hope now that attitudes are changing. I do believe that with the increased prevalence and integration of AI into daily life, people will begin to appreciate these kinds of other skills that emerge from arts and humanities education a bit more. So ideally, that would include like media literacy. Can you tell if something is made by AI or not? Can you sift through things that are factual and things that are not? These kinds of things that come from critical thinking. Ability to build meaningful relationships, ability to work in teams. These are some of the things that I do think can come from an arts and humanities education. But at the same time, it can go both ways, right? You as an arts and humanities person, you join a specific sector that maybe is not very intuitively aligned. I get a job working in shipping, or I get a job working in finance, or I get a job working in biotech, and maybe I'm not in a technical role, but I'm still in a role that means that I need to know something about the business, and so we learn on the job. But on the flip side, people who do medicine or people who do the sciences, if they love art and literature, then there are also still opportunities to learn about those throughout the course of one's life. Um, so, and okay, this is not me being like, oh, lifelong learning is great, everyone go do skills future kind of thing, but more to say that if university education is a significant part of one's life journey and one's journey of learning, but also doesn't have to be the defining thing that happens in a person's life. So anyone who's interested in studying arts and humanities, I would say just do it if you have the means and if you have the support. I think because it can be very hard if your parents are not willing to support you or pay for school and you want to do it. So, I mean, in those kinds of situations, then a bit more sympathetic, right? Like their hands are tied a little bit, but there's still opportunities to learn or do a mod or something to keep that interest going. But if you are able to, then I think people should, because I think we're all the better for people who have this kind of academic grounding in arts and humanities, just as people who are interested in the world, interested in society, interested in the kinds of art and culture that other people create.
Wow, that's incredible. You actually answered my next question, which was I was gonna ask about. I don't know how you must have access to my question bank. I wanted to ask, what is one skill from your humanities background that in today's world of AI has become so incredibly scarce? And
Oh yes, right.
sorry.
Yeah.
And therefore that skill is very highly valued, and you answered it, pretty well. So I think we're going to move on to our last question, and it's
Sure.
more of a if you were to meet your 18-year-old self, what advice would you give him about navigating the world, especially since your journey till now has been really diverse, and I'm assuming you must have had a lot of challenges along the way. So to
Yeah.
someone in that position, what advice do you have?
I don't know, my 18-year-old self. I mean, one thing that I think is like, I just tell him to chill out and stop taking, not take do things well and seriously, but stop taking himself so seriously. I think my great humbling came when I was in NS, and I think I'm better for having done NS. I was an infantry sergeant working just with people from very different backgrounds. It's probably because I did NS and I had that platoon of guys looking at me that when I finally went to teach our class, I didn't feel so scared. Because, room of 30, 13-year-olds, very different from a platoon of, 30 guys in their, late teens, early 20s, for whom what happened in camp had a pretty serious effect on their lives. It might affect if they're able to book out, if they're forced to stay in camp, and things like that. Anyway, so if I look back to my 18-year-old self, it's kind of interesting thing because I remember growing up and I couldn't envision my life beyond being 18, and then when I was in NS, I couldn't envision my life beyond NS, and then life just kept continuing. So chill out, don't take yourself so seriously, care deeply about the things that you care about, learn and read as much as you can, cherish your relationships. And I think, yeah, I think, maybe it would have been better if I had learned the importance of, just making time for relationships earlier on in my life, back then. Not that I wasn't, but I think I understood it much better as I grew older. But I guess, I tell this to an 18-year-old, they're going to go, whatever, what are you talking about? I've got my good friends already. And maybe I would tell that 18-year-old to just be open to whatever is available, whatever opportunities there are, and not to be so rigid in thinking about what my life could be. So those are a few things that come to mind. In 2014, in a very different world.
Wow. So what I'm taking is, because I don't think we are too far from 18 as well. I don't think how old are we? 20, 22. We're not too far. So life is not that serious. School is not that serious. It's advice I will tell myself when I see my grades.
No. I mean, you take what you have to do seriously, but you don't have to take yourself so seriously. Right?
That's
And
good
so there's a way
advice.
of trying to separate them out a little bit, not to think too much or too highly of yourself all the time.
Yeah, no, that was beautifully put. And I think with that, we've come to like the sort of perfect ending for this episode. So once again, thanks, Jonathan, for coming on and being our guest. And as always, we'll see you guys in the next episode.
Good luck, everyone. All the best.
Hey, thanks for making it to the end of this video. If you have enjoyed it, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and follow us on our socials on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Spotify in the links in the description down below. And see you in the next video.